Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. I am Cecilia D'Alessandro, Policy Officer in the Sustainable Food System and Green Transition and Climate Action Programs at ECDPM, the Center for Africa-Europe Relations. Today, I will be moderating this roundtable titled The Water, Energy, Food Nexus in the Sahel, North Africa and the Middle East, as part of the COP27 Cascading Climate Risks Virtual Pavilion. Water scarcity is an increasing problem in many regions, and the dry areas of the Sahel, Middle East, and North Africa are amongst the most affected. At the same time, different sectors, such as food and energy, are increasingly competing for the use of scarce water resources. This can create challenging trade-offs, especially in light of climate change. The combination of strong tensions amongst these three sectors, with more frequent weather hazards and large socioeconomic inequalities, impacts vulnerable communities the most, and poses risks for food, water, and energy security, as well as social cohesion, stability, and peace. In this context, a water-energy-food nexus, or in short, the WEF nexus approach, is increasingly used to think beyond single sectors and deal with these simultaneous pressures. But what does it look like in practice? And how can it be implemented at different levels, local, national, and regional level? Today, we welcome 4 experts who will present concrete experiences from North Africa, the Middle East, and the Sahel, more specifically discussing ways to make choices over the use of water for energy or food and the tensions that this can create. They will also present ideas on how to solve this. With this expert discussion, we aim to provide practical and policy solutions to take a WEF nexus approach to better manage natural resources across borders and adapt to climate change. As the chair, I will start by asking our panelists one key question. Each panelist will have a few minutes to respond per question. Then I will take questions from the audience for the remaining time. Before we get started, can I please ask all panelists to please be on mute unless you are speaking? And let me now introduce you to our first experts. So first we have Sophie Desmidt. She leads the workstream on peace, security, and resilience at ECDPM. So she's my colleague. Sophie is based in Brussels, Belgium, and her work focuses on security, resilience, gender, and the linkages between climate change and security. In the context of Cascades, an interdisciplinary research project, she conducted research on the possible dilemmas posed by cascading climate risks for North African countries. Secondly, we have Dr. Abdou Boubacar. He is a water and climate change expert, currently working as a technical advisor to the Frexus project at GIZ, which he joined in 2021. Prior to GIZ, Dr. Boko was Environmental and Safety Program Coordinator at the US Embassy of Niger, and also Environmental and Water Resources Expert at the Sahel Consulting Group, where he performed projects for multinational clients in water resource evaluation, climate change impacts, as well as site assessments. Thirdly, we have Mr. Achref Chibani. He is a non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, focusing on climate change in the Middle East and North Africa. He's a Tunisian journalist, researcher, and civil society activist whose core areas of focus are climate change, renewable energies, and environmental protection. Based in Tataouine, southern Tunisia, Achref is also an early career researcher representative at the MENA Social Policy Network. He was also formerly a visiting scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars Middle East program. Last but not least, we have Ms. Roula Majdalani. She's a senior climate change advisor at the Director General Office of ICARDA. She has a long-standing career with the United Nations, holding different development and political portfolios in the Middle East and Africa. She has also served as the director of the Arab Center for Climate Change Policies and cluster leader of climate change and natural resource sustainability at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. She has extensive experience in strengthening intergovernmental collaboration on the sustainable management of natural resources, with a focus on water, energy, and food security under challenging conditions of climate change. So, without further ado, let me pose now the first question to all our panelists. Sophie will share her perspectives first. Sophie, you've worked extensively in North Africa. Based on your work, what are some of the possible security and development challenges that result from climate change? And what does that mean for water and energy provision in the region? Over to you, Sophie.
Thank you so much, Cecilia, for that introduction, and good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here with my distinguished colleagues on the panel and to be part of this Chatham House Virtual Pavilion series of events in the run-up to the COP, or as part of the COP. And as Cecilia mentioned, I'd like to present the research that we conducted through the project Cascades on North Africa to sort of set the scene and present some of the dilemmas that we identified with regards to climate change impacts on security and development in 3 countries in North Africa: Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. And so the starting point for our research was really sort of the well-established consensus by now that the combination of climate change, and in particular the increased rainfall variability and rapid temperature increases, mean that Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia will be, are consistently projected to become climate hotspots by the end of the 21st century, although with possibly very different impacts and differences. For example, certain areas of southern Algeria becoming greener, but also diverging impacts on rural areas versus cities, for example. And in these scenarios, the weakest link, if you want, is really the decreasing availability of groundwater and the effect of climate change on surface water as a result also of temperature rise and evaporation and decreased rainfall. And in these countries, the limited amount of water is also used in a range of very water-intensive sectors, and particularly agriculture. And the majority of agriculture in the region is rain-fed, and 85% of freshwater resources are consumed by agriculture. For example, in Morocco, groundwater reserves have fallen by almost 80% since 1960. But climate change at the same time is also driving up demand for renewable energy, energy for cooling, energy production for export, renewable energy for export. So the interrelationships between water, food, and energy really pose very difficult trade-offs for these countries, and they also result in unintended and possibly negative consequences, despite ambitious plans to really tackle the issues. And the depletion of water resources is not just an impact or an effect of climate change. It's also due to the overuse and also mismanagement of water at the moment, with insufficient water infrastructure, and also at the same time a population growth, rapid urbanization, improved standards of living, and increased demands for energy. And so these dynamics, interrelated dynamics, really place an immense pressure on available water resources. And in this context, we identified sort of 3 sets of potential challenges and dilemmas. And I'd like to present them now. So a first one is really related to the management and the allocation of water resources in this context of growing demand, population growth, and economic growth. And this includes the use and allocation of water, for example, groundwater from aquifers, and the potential that this could lead to growing tensions and conflicts. In many places in North Africa, our research showed that the allocation of water has become increasingly politicized and is leading to protests and tensions between communities and interest groups within society. There are ambitious plans to address the shortage of water, for example, building dams, desalination plants, water highways. But we know that an increase in a resource does not necessarily mean a decrease in conflict if there is a disagreement about allocation or use between different interest groups. And so, for example, there are examples of increased water from dams or infrastructure projects being allocated rather to the benefit of export-oriented large-scale agro-businesses to the detriment of small-scale farming communities, for example. And this is something that we see increasing, and that is not being addressed at the moment. A second challenge that we're seeing is also a risk in rising inequalities in the context of sort of socioeconomic grievances and protests, and climate change is adding to that. There are quite high levels of rural-urban migration and sort of diminishing investments in rural livelihoods, relatively low spending in rural areas, and we also see in this context that environmental protests in rural areas are on the rise, but they also take place in a very difficult context of political transitions and reform process, with very scattered levels of participation by local communities and local authorities. And so in this context, first, we see that climate change could really intensify the pressures on rural-urban migration and on urban climate resilience, with infrastructure and resources coming under pressure, an increase in informal employment, and challenges to services that are also part of the climate change adaptation discussion, such as waste management, health, and education services. At the same time, managing this rural-urban migration is really important because these are also important forms of alternative livelihoods, and they generate remittances and incomes for migrants and their families. And the impact on climate change is expected to be quite severe, with temperature increases in North African cities projected between 1.5 and 3 Celsius at the very least, with also impacts related to that, such as desertification and impacts on high energy consumption for cooling, food security, sanitation, and health. Another development in this regard is that we see, and it was mentioned already before, increased environmental degradation is also leading to sort of environmentally inspired social protests in a context where communities are discontent about current governance. And these conditions for social unrest are already present in North Africa. They're not new, but there's a new layer of environmental discontent being added to that, because especially younger populations do not agree with how their governments are managing environmental problems. And in Morocco and Tunisia, this has happened through sporadic protests. But in Algeria, we've seen mass protests that have taken place in the past 3 to 4 years. Also with historically low oil prices in the region and the difficult economic conditions following the pandemic. This is really leading to a combination where social protests are quite an important factor of how communities also show their discontent. Some examples also include the thirst protests over drinking water, or the environmental protests against shale gas fracking in Algeria, which are also connected to questions around marginalization of Algeria's southern regions. A third challenge that we identified is really related to the unintended, possibly negative consequences of climate change policies in North Africa, as a result of incoherences and also contradictions within those policies. This is really noticeable with regards to the energy transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, which has important implications on the use of resources such as water, but also land and government spending such as subsidies. And there's a very mixed picture in this regard with regards to the 3 countries in North Africa. Algeria remains very dependent on hydrocarbon exports among the 3 countries, with quite a slow rate of reform towards renewable energy production and also exports, and a system of heavy government subsidies, although there are some indications or initiatives to change this. But there are powerful interests at stake that have slowed down these reforms from special interest groups, stakeholders that really benefit from these hydrocarbon incomes. And despite on paper ambitious targets set for example, solar power in 2030, the reforms have been quite slow. By contrast, Morocco is quite advanced in terms of production of renewable energy, especially solar power, and has tried to embark on a process to become less reliant on fossil fuels. But there are quite some critical questions being put around the scale of investments to establish the necessary infrastructure, the centralized decision-making around renewable energy investments, and the impact of these decisions on resources and local communities. Another example there is also the contradiction between Morocco's leadership on climate change adaptation, renewable and solar power, but also its emphasis on agriculture and tourism, which are sectors where there is quite an entrenched, unsustainable use of water. But these sectors are very important for huge parts of the population. So
thank you, Sophie.
Difficult dilemmas and a very mixed picture coming out of the region.
Thank you, Sophie, for these insights. Very rich picture you're painting with very different interests and situations in the three countries that you're mentioning, Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. And I also liked how you highlighted the fact that allocation of resources is what we really need to look at. And it's not just a matter of increasing the resource, but it's about the fair allocation of it. So thanks a lot for these insights. I would like now to hand over to our second speaker, Boubacar Abdou Boko, to reflect on another question. In your experience, what are the key ingredients to improve security and resilience in fragile contexts in the Sahel through a water, energy, and food nexus approach? And is there potential for a regional approach to build resilience? Thank you. Boubacar, the floor is yours.
Thank you and good morning. Thank you for having me into this panel. Your question is very interesting in the context of the Sahelian climate change, impact, adaptation. I would like first to put some context factors to present the situation of the Sahel and how, for example, we need to act in order for us to increase resilience at different level of interventions, like from communities to regional and international level. First, just to provide one overview of the context of Sahelian, you have for the Niger Basin Authority and the Lake Chad Basin, two regional organizations. You have almost 210 million of populations, which 80% of these populations rely on rain-fed agriculture. And this is an important aspect to understand the context of fragility and the conflict in the Sahelian region. So 80% of these populations rely on rain-fed agriculture. And with the climate change impact, having impact on rainfall variability and with recurrent extreme events like droughts and flood, those populations are continuously being affected by climate change. So to be able to increase resilience of those populations with the food, water and food energy nexus, there are already some institutional framework that is set up there. You have what we call the regional basin organizations. Those regional basin organizations include, for example, for the NBA, you have 9 countries with different socioeconomic profiles and development level that came together, and they already set up some legal framework. Like if you have the NBA, you have the water charter. The water charter is a kind of juridical instrument that allows the governance of water, energy, and the food security at the country levels. And other side, you have also the Lake Chad Basin Commission, which also have its own water charter that include all those elements of water, energy, and the food security nexus. So at this level of intervention, like between countries, those regional organizations are able to maintain a dialogue, to maintain a kind of governance between countries, which I think contribute a lot in preventing tensions and the conflict at national, like country levels. But the issue is more on local level. How can we include the local communities' concerns about impact of climate change in preventing conflict through the water, energy, and the food security and the food security nexus? That is the main issue. And for me, and based on the Froxys project experience on the local, national, and regional level, we notice that there is some disconnection between the local and the national and even supranational level in terms of interventions. So what is kind of a success between countries in terms of conflict prevention, because you have between these countries, you have some water shortage, and this water shortage is promoting the use of the intersectoral interdependencies of the water, energy, and the food nexuses. You have some multi-purpose dams that is quite well managed between countries, and the energy and the product of the food security are quite well managed at national levels. But conflict raised at local levels because between communities, because in fact there are disconnections between governance. When you talk about water, energy, and the food at local level in the Sahelian context, people would like to have in their livelihoods a program and a project that will be able to provide, first of all, to provide lands. This is the main issues. If you would like to have to increase resilience, we need to accelerate program and project that will help implement sustainable governance, land access, and land governance at local levels, because you have population depending on natural resource management, natural resources which depends on climate. And if adaptation programs and projects that would like to help through the nexus of water, energy, and the food, because it's the same thing there at local level. You need water. If you need water, you need to provide energy. And if you have the energy, you need to have infrastructure that will be able to provide food and all those stuff. Then increasing local governance, land access, which natural resources depend on, will help project and the program increase resilience. But the issue here, the important point to notice about this governance is that every project, every program that intervene at local level need to systematically add a component of peace building into those adaptation, climate adaptation, food security, into the project. If you do not introduce a peace building approach integrated with the adaptation, climate change adaptation strategies, then you will create tensions and the conflict as at local levels. Because as I told you, at national and the regional level, the framework is quite there and is working, but is disconnected from the local level. And when it's disconnected from local level, what happens is that you provide knowledge and reflections and ideas, project at national level, and you come to implement them on the field without taking into account the local population needs and their perspective in those projects. Then that's why you are seeing that the tensions and the conflict between, for example, farmer and herders is increasing a lot in these regions, because it doesn't have the local communities' voices into those projects. And even if they have, there is no peace building approach accompanying those projects and those programs. So what I would like to suggest is that to be able to increase the implications and the involving of local communities in the design and programming of the project, introduce peace building component in every single adaptation, climate change adaptations project, and to be able in the framework of the governance, provide a way to connect local, national, and regional level.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boko. I think your call is very clear. I really understand how you're connecting, trying to to think of better connection between the different governance scales. And although there are regional organizations that are working quite well in terms of management of water resources, if you don't look at the local level, you don't really involve local communities, understand their needs, and improve also the land governance aspects, including looking at current conflicts that are created by an unequal distribution of land, you will not be able to solve and the issue and go back to a more climate resilient future. So thanks a lot for highlighting these aspects. I would like now to hand over to our third speaker, Mr. Chibani, to reflect on the following question. How can governments respond to the pressing challenge of water scarcity in North Africa in an integrated way? And also, given what we've just heard from our previous speakers, can you provide some example of locally based solutions to this problem in North Africa? The floor is yours, Achref.
Thank you so much, Cecilia, and I'm pleased to take part in these important conversations. And good morning, everyone. I would like to start with saying this. North African communities have a long history of water management and governance, from millennia-old underground water channels and other methods of water storage and collection to 20th century dam and hydropower projects. Humans have long intervened in the region's hydrologic cycle. Such infrastructure and water management techniques reflect the historic importance of the careful conservation and transportation of water in North Africa. However, the growing global climate emergency is placing ever greater stresses on North Africa's water infrastructure, as the level, intensity, and variability of seasonal precipitation are radically changing along with the climate. It's important to take a wide-angle view of the nexus between climate change and water scarcity in the region, and to implement a multi-level approach to water scarcity that is attentive to local, national, and regional needs. Such a stance pushes against the tendency to consider water politics and solutions to climate change as being bound by the borders of the nation state. Both extend to water distribution and the social, political, and economic stresses that water scarcity is producing demand an ability to move between
Achref, can I interrupt you for a second? We don't see you. Would it be possible to put on your camera while you're speaking?
Ah, sorry.
No problem.
I think it was open.
Now it's on. Thanks. That's great. You can continue.
Yeah, is it okay? I said
you disappeared again.
Sorry?
You disappeared again. We saw you for a moment.
Wait, just a second.
Now it's good.
Yeah. Okay. Wait a secend.
If it's not possible, don't worry. We can.
No, it's fine. But like, just okay. I don't know. Wait, is it fine?
Is it fine? It is fine. Yes.
Okay, amazing. So North Africa has experienced urban population growth in cities along its Mediterranean coast, with the region's urban population increasing from approximately 34% of the total in the 1960s to 56% in 2019. So these population centers are often far from inland groundwater and mountainous areas with higher rainfall. So that's why a paramount challenge has therefore been to design infrastructure to transport water to urban centers. We can take the example of Libya. For instance, in Libya, the Great Man-Made River Project was inaugurated in 1984 to transport groundwater from desert aquifers to the country's coastal cities. And now the largest groundwater transport system in the world. It transports some 2.5 million cubic meters of water per day to Libyan cities such as Tripoli, Benghazi, Sirte, and El Zawiya. However, so this is the importance of the second part of your question. Such water mega projects are inefficient, difficult to maintain, and deplete what is ultimately a finite resource. But given its current political instability and deep factional divides, Libya needs a more pragmatic approach, such as focusing efforts on the establishment of local level water associations to manage, operate, raise awareness around, and maintain a community's water system. Such associations have been particularly successful in its neighbor, Tunisia, for instance, where nearly 2,500 associations exist to manage drinking water and irrigation. Notwithstanding the importance of desalination and waste management in Libya, creative, locally based solutions should not be overlooked. Indeed, Libya has a tradition of household-centered water conservation and use, alongside sinking wells for personal use. Traditional Libyan houses often contain a majan. In Tunisia, in southern Tunisia, we call it majal, which is a basin for collecting seasonal rainwater, which can cleanly store water for months. In addition, the ancient system of groundwater management known as qanat and found across the Middle East and North Africa offers a sustainable and energy efficient alternative to deep wells and the great man-made river project. Qanats only draw water at the rate that groundwater is replenished and use gravity rather than energy intensive pumps to bring water to the surface. Taking inspiration from such traditional practices and water management and combining them with modern technologies, I think it offers a potential alternative to large-scale water infrastructures and allows individual households and communities to protect themselves against water shortages.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Chibani, for these very concrete examples you're bringing in terms of understanding how there are also low-cost, small solutions that can really benefit communities and maybe even more efficient at larger scale, big infrastructures that oftentimes are more the focus of North African governments. So I would like now to hand over to our last speaker, Roula Majdalani, for the following question. So countries in the Middle East are among the most water insecure, but they are also highly dependent on food imports to meet their population's nutritional needs, which makes them particularly vulnerable to global food commodity shocks. Demand for energy is also rising, and we are witnessing heavy inflation in some countries, like, for example, your home country, Lebanon. Can you tell us from your experience, how can these countries strengthen resilience and simultaneously tackle water, food, and energy insecurity in a volatile situation like the one I described? The floor is yours, Roula.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Let me start by contextualizing that question that is so fashionable nowadays, but has always existed, the nexus, and that interdependence between three key vital sectors, particularly in the Middle East. To start with, okay, my colleagues and we all know, I won't overstate it. Water, I won't go into details, but we know how scarce water is. But we need to remember that water, it's mostly groundwater, and we have about 50% of it is groundwater in the region, which means we need energy for water. For desalination, for groundwater pumping, for wastewater drainage, treatment, reuse. When we know how much energy is used for producing water, this rings the bell that we really need, and we don't understand very well, and we don't have it, if you want, systematically in terms of information in tracking how much the sectors are interdependent. For example, just to give you, and this is from previous work that has been done, there are still gaps in the knowledge that we have, but I'll just give you a few examples. Jordan, for example, Jordanian water sector accounts for 15% of total annual electricity generated. In Saudi Arabia, groundwater pumping goes to up to 10% of the total fuel consumption. In Libya, it accounts 14% of total fuel consumption. Bahrain uses 30% of energy for desalination. So that interdependence is very striking. When you look at the interdependence between water and food, on average, the region is water for irrigation goes from 70 to 80% for agriculture. Yet it is not, it's at a low productivity and does not exceed 12% of GDP. Yet it provides, and here the tricky and the complexity is that it provides about 30 to 40% of livelihood to rural communities. So we do have a situation that lends itself to the need to look at these resources together and not in silos or separately. Another dimension also to remember and factor into this complexity is that over 60% of our water in the region is shared water, and we are downstream countries, except for Lebanon, which is the only country that is upstream, but mostly downstream. And so what does that mean? It means that the nexus needs to be well accounted for when negotiation is happening. It's water not just for drinking and water allocation. And we see the challenges that are happening along on the Nile issue with the great dam that is being constructed. What does that mean? Ethiopia has its right for development, yet the Egyptian, this is a lifeline for them. Same thing in the case of Iraq and Jordan with the Euphrates and Tigris. So one needs to really take into consideration when you negotiate, when we bring negotiators, and we've done that in the past when I was still with the ESCWA, and they are still continuing with these initiatives, to account for a nexus approach that really it clears the stumbling block or can help negotiation and assist, if you want, in diffusing, not I won't say in resolving, but diffusing part of the tension when you look at that type of interdependency. Added to that, population growth, of course, adds to that pressure. And in countries that have vulnerability, that are precarious, that are going through conflict, that, as Sophie has mentioned, that brings politicization of access to resources. Lebanon and Jordan have been accounting, for example, lack of water, that it is because we have very, very large migrant population from the migrant Syrian population, over 1.5 million in each country, and and it's creating tension between the communities because they are accused of they're accusing them that they are taking their water. Now, of course, if you ask me, in my humble opinion, it's more a problem also of mismanagement that has been escalated and amplified by the wave of migrants. But there again, you bring in countries that when you have vulnerable countries and vulnerable communities, these issues become much more amplified. And what amplifies it even more is, of course, the issue of the climate change. Less water resources. We know that, for example, in not just a water-stressed area, but water that groundwater recharge is much lower than what it was with the impact of climate change, and it affects surface and subsurface water, and it affects soil moisture and food production. And already we were already a region that imported over 50% of its food intake. Yet, and here I want to highlight also problems of management, again, that get amplified by that. In a water-stressed region, for example, one cannot really justify why water is subsidized. Why one cannot justify with a highest food importing region. We are one of the regions that has most of food waste. and in the same thing, with energy, with the largest reserves of energy, we have areas and disparities, a lot of disparities in access to energy and in the quality of the service, the reliability, the affordability of energy. So these, I think that the nexus comes out into light with these compounded problems, with, as I said, population, with climate change, and with precarious governance structures in these countries. And therefore, it makes a very strong case for addressing the nexus approach. So the nexus, as I said, it is the nature and the characteristics of these water, energy, food shows how interdependent they are and will have to be. And it shows also that solutions will have to come through a nexus lens. It brings a lot of opportunities. For example, when we look at decoupling freshwater production from fossil fuel, it allows, it frees budget, it allows for energy saving, it allows for energy reserves to be exported and maintain, if you want, to maintain a balance of payment in that sense. But it also allows for, if we scale renewable energy, we can mitigate emissions. It addresses one of the big challenges and pressures that we are seeing, particularly that this is in the context of COP27, and would allow replenishing marine habitat, especially with countries in the Gulf that are highly dependent on desalination, and that affects the marine environment in the sea.
Thank you, Roula. May I ask you to wrap up quickly?
Okay.
We would like to open the floor for questions from the audience.
Okay, so there are opportunities. One needs to look at the question of tariffs, the question of tools, the question of how do we manage demand, how do we factor in ecological and environmental factor when we price water and energy services. But in this region, let me say, where are the bottlenecks? The bottlenecks, first of all, are in the information gap. We don't know really in a systematic way when these resources are managed, to what extent they are interdependent. And for that, we really need indicators that work across and in a time context. I gave a few examples, but the knowledge is, the information is not across the board and across time. The second thing is working through institutions that can look at through an intergovernmental level, to look across the institutions where ministries don't work in silos. There have been initiatives in the region. One can speak, for example, we have at ESCWA we had a joint committee of the water and energy ministerial committees. This is also in the League of Arab States. We also helped them establish a joint water and agriculture councils of ministers to work together. This is a very important part of the process of building a nexus. But you really need to change again the mindset in that it's easier said than done. When we were working with them, many of them did not really understand how the other ministries function. Water were looking at agriculture as their client, whereas or energy were looking at water as their client. And increasingly, you really need to build up that when you say interdependence, stakeholders need to work as partners and as stakeholders impacting each other. And I just want to draw on a very important point that our colleague from Niger mentioned, the importance of having institutions such as river basin organizations. These are very important to address the governance issues beyond bringing task forces. This is very important because it can address the conflict. There are always trade-offs to be managed. Like Sophie mentioned, there are competitions at the local level, but also at the national level, but even more so at the regional. And when you're talking about transboundary water, but a better understanding and working through these joint basin organization, a lot of these challenges can be addressed. I'm sorry I took some time over to you. Back to you, Cecilia.
Thank you, Roula. No, that's great. I mean, you're sharing a lot of knowledge on very complex topics. I think what I retain really from your intervention, which was really rich, is not only the aspect of the interconnections between sectors, but also across countries, and they need to find better management of shared resources, particularly water resources. Also, both you and Sophie touched upon the aspect of the allocation of resources being a political topic. It's not just about technical solutions to the WEF nexus approach. And also you mentioned the information gap being quite a critical aspect to solve for improved approaches. The importance of working at the intergovernmental level, and also the importance of changing mindsets. So I would like now to open the floor for questions from the audience. We have about 25 minutes to go. I would like to invite the audience to ask questions to our experts by sending any questions they might have through the chat function. Please, when you do so, include your name and organization with your question, and if you wish a particular panelist to address your question, include that in your intervention. I see we already have one question in the line from Chris Eilert from Chatham House. I'll read it out loud, and then whoever amongst you would like to take it, you can raise your hand. What do the panelists think is the best way that international donors and development banks can target financial resources to address these complex problems? Achref, you can go first.
Yeah, thank you so much for these interesting questions. And as I see it, I think that international donors should encourage the governments in the MENA region and in the Sahel to invest more in renewable energy sources, including solar, wind, and tidal energy, which should shift occur alongside the move away from highly centralized energy production models, empowering small private sector actors to participate in energy production. Also, I think it's important that the international organizations and international maybe banks should support the agriculture sector, and which should be update its practices to deal with increased climate variability and its effects on land and water resources. You know, the 20th century saw the MENA agricultural policy move towards global industrial agricultural methods, large-scale, capital-intensive, single crop production propped up by government incentives and subsidized. I think this is I think instead, agricultural strategies should be restituted in local knowledges. That's why we discussed the locally based solutions of water management, climate and soil, then combined with modern technologies to better support private production at the local level. And last but not least, maybe I strongly believe that in the Sahel or the MENA region, the hydrological and energy infrastructure must be viewed as a combined system, because as climate change changes the flow of surface and increases land water evaporation, management of the region's hydrological and energy infrastructure must be adjusted to fluctuating supply and demand pressures and enable more efficient and equitable distribution of water. For example, the region's many dams are dependent on reliable water supplies for energy generation capacity, but in turn affect downstream agricultural water supplies.
Thank you, Achref, for these very complete answers. I hope this answered Chris' question. Roula, you had your hand raised. Did you want to add something to what Achref just mentioned?
Well, that's a very good question, actually, that Chris raised. And being at the COP and having the question of finance as the centerpiece of that COP, and really to maintain faith in a COP process that in the future and not lose really billions of people who want to see multilateralism win the battle against climate change. I think the question of funding, first of all, we should see that countries live up to the commitments and move on to from pledges to actual funding and raising the portfolio of funding, but also not just any funding for adaptation. This is really a cornerstone of the COP process. There has been progress in looking at more understanding that there needs to be a balance between funding, adaptation, and mitigation on equal footing, which has not been the case for many developing countries. We've had 3/4 of funding that goes for mitigation as opposed to adaptation. And particularly for poorer countries, having loans is not really the answer. It puts more pressure on their public purse, and there has to be more accommodation for grants to projects. The range of projects, as it was mentioned, I think water projects are very important, agriculture projects are very important, but one needs to really see that enough funding comes in. We are still not at the level that are required. This is that part. The other thing, and which is really good in that COP, is that the question of loss and damage has been put on the agenda of the COP and of the negotiation. We are still a long way. There are a lot of complexities involved in loss and damage. I won't get into that now because it will take the whole session. But the question of loss and damage is really what countries need to address, and that is on top of what is already, it's not as a substitute. And I'm sure that Boubacar will raise more in this line. I see his, because this is after all an Africa COP, and I think many countries have come well prepared with projects, with portfolios. And developed countries need to rise to the occasion and fulfill the commitments. Over to you.
Thanks, Roula. I'll hand over to Boubacar if he wants to quickly respond to add his thoughts to this question, because in the meantime, other 2 questions are coming in, so I'd like to have a chance to add.
Thank you. I would like to echo what has just been said, but I would like to add something important, because everybody is just talking about adaptation, founding adaptation. I think we need to emphasize on the peace building approach, and the core of the project should take place, and the founding also should take place at the local levels. That's my perspective. I think if we talk about founding adaptation, we should accompany the term with peace building. Peace building, which includes dialogue, governance at different level, and then management of all those adaptation projects, because sometimes they also create tensions, because as I told, the climate is impacting natural resources. When you provide inputs in terms of access to water, energy, and the food security, and if you do not accompany with sustainable peace building approach on how to manage all those actions, there is a risk of creating more tensions and conflict around those natural resources. The second point is that the entry point for me is to use local municipalities, local governments into as target to those funds, which will allow necessarily the implications and the involvement of local communities in the design and in the project. Then I think regional basin organizations also can play an important role or into mobilizations of those funding, because they are addressing multinational, multi-level challenges. So I think regional organizations are a good entry point, and also focused with, or even implemented with in line with the local government at local levels, at municipality levels. And please, I would like also to advocate in those adaptations, founding institutions, that these adaptations funds should integrate peace building approach, because there is a risk of creating more conflict if we do not accompany with peace building dialogue approaches.
Thank you, Boubacar. Your call for peace building approaches to be integrated in the resilience actions is very clear. And I think it helps also to answer the question of Chris. I would like to ask you also another question from my side, and then look again at the audience questions for the rest of the time. How do you ensure that resilience building actions are inclusive? I mean, from your perspective, from the practice really of programs and projects, how do you include women, young people, and vulnerable groups in resilience building actions? What do you need to take into account in your programming to do that effectively? And I think I'm thinking about Boubacar for this question, because you have a practitioner.
Sophie, do you want to take this?
Sorry? You're muted, Boubacar.
Yes, I said come again, please.
I wanted to ask you a question.
Go ahead, please.
Regarding the inclusivity of projects and actions of resilience building, how do you ensure that women, youth, and vulnerable groups are included in an effective way and can participate in a meaningful way?
Yes, this is very good questions. I think the core of the challenges in Sahel are how can we include efficiently women and the young into resilience. And I think one example from Frexus project is that whatever we do, if we consider the okay.
We can hear you, Boubacar. You can go on.
Okay, if you consider that the heart of the issue is including vulnerable groups like women and young, because there is an alert on how women now are more and more mobilized into alimenting and amplifying conflict. And I think from our examples of Frexus implementing project in Niger, Mali, and Chad, we were able to create what we call dialogue spaces for women and the young, which will make sure that those voices are heard and take into account in the solutions of the problems. And then I think those kind of dialogue space specifically dedicated to those groups that will allow them to express their needs, to express the way they can also contribute. Because sometimes we just overlook the way that beyond the needs of those vulnerable groups, they may constitute the core solution, like the core of the solutions. They can contribute a lot in implementing and provide sustainable solutions. So if we create those kind of space of dialogue and moderate, help them express how they can contribute to sustainable actions, like to sustainable resilience into programming, I think they can provide a lot of input that are very meaningful and that are very efficient. So I think part of the solutions come from those vulnerable groups, and we should create space for them to express how they could do that and what they will need to do that at different level, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Boko. Roula, you have a point.
Sorry, I was having a problem with the connection.
We can hear you and see you well.
Okay, very good. I think it's very important to understand very well the context. We often hear we need to scale up. Big donors want big mega projects. And it's true, mega projects are needed for the $1 trillion that are needed to address climate change, the impact of climate change, to adapt, to mitigate, and all that. But sometimes we forget that with high level, for example, we speak of technology transfer. We don't always ask to what extent technology is well adapted to the context. Sometimes we really need, particularly in a region like ours, you need to, and in the farming communities and in agricultural community, you need low scale type of energy to address irrigation, to address agricultural needs, and that is not always addressed in the right. You need affordable, for example, technology. You need a technology where local farmers and local people can maintain it and improve it and upgrade on it and find
Roula, you're breaking up a bit now. Could you turn off your camera?
Okay.
We could hear you well until now, but you started to break up.
Okay. Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So there is a need to understand very well the local level and what is their carrying capacity? How much can they move on? And I think a lot of the development, we need to remember many of the successful cases of development are the ones where it happens incrementally. Maybe donors don't always have the time and the interest to go incrementally. Maybe governments, they want big type of large-scale projects, and these are needed in many cases. I'm not saying one should preclude the other, but when you want to address inclusiveness, you really need to see to what extent that local capacity is there, and building that capacity and having the right institutions to follow up with them that change. The change that is expected. Over.
Thank you, Roula. I think I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think this resonates also with the point of Achref in his intervention in terms of the different scales of interventions and the need to focus not only on larger scale, more expensive interventions that certainly can be needed, but can be also become very inefficient, and also focus on a local level and local-led solutions. So thanks a lot for highlighting this point. There is a question from Sam Martin from Chatham House. I will read it out loud. In this region, we see the effects of great power competition in the form of foreign nations looking to fund large engineering projects. But these investments often have strings attached. So how do you panelists believe we can help to fuel local investment in engineering and education so that the nations of this region can focus on the water, energy, food nexus according to their own needs? Who would like to take up this question? Mr. Boko, you have the floor.
Yes, this is.
And then Sophie.
That has just been described. This questions the reality of our regions, and also it's an output. It's just a result of not including local governance institutions into projects and the program. And I think another way of, and it resulted in many cases in conflict, in high level conflict, with tensions, with violence. To avoid those kind of interventions which deny or which create those kind of exclusions in our context, for Sahelian context. I think we have local institutional framework and the governance framework where local voices, local communities needs should be considered, even in those kind of large scale engineering program. We have good experiences in our countries, like I'm talking about good examples of hydropower and agricultural project related to it with communities through cooperative, NGOs, and women organizations are the core management system of this kind of big engineering project, and it works quite well. And I think sometimes there is a kind of label that is done to local governance institutions, and this is not the reality. If you organize women, you organize local communities into organizations, you can follow up. There is a transparency line, and you can really implement those kind of big engineering projects by including and for the communities, and they will take benefit. They will get benefit of that.
Thank you, Mr. Boko. Sophie, you would like to add to this question?
Yes, I think some of the elements were already mentioned by Roula and Boubacar before, but I think it's really, one way would be to support interdisciplinary research partnerships that can really bring together an assessment of the needs in terms of education and needs in specific sectors that look at agriculture, engineering, but also geography and social sciences. And there are examples, for example, in the Sahel about looking at climate resilience and bringing together universities from the region to help sort of strengthen the capacity of education systems to develop research and needs assessments. Another element that was already looked at was really to support the participation of local authorities and rebalance really sort of the emphasis on large-scale funding and privatization with building up the capacity of local authorities to participate in these dialogues with central governments, because they are very close to what is happening on the ground. There are very local differences in terms of how cities and authorities are affected by climate change and the composition of their citizens in terms of what they need in terms of water and energy. So I think that needs to be rebalanced, but it's a long-term process, because this requires from also international actors, including, for example, the European Union, a lot more flexibility and more adaptation in terms of how projects run their course, but need to be adapted to challenges that may arise. We're all familiar with projects that have log frames and objectives, but sometimes you need to readjust along the way, and I think that's always difficult for international donors, but there is a way to do it and to adapt maybe in a more flexible manner to the needs that arise. And I think another element that I'd like to mention is maybe, for example, for the EU, to think about the coherence between different policies and initiatives. There is, for example, the farm to fork policy, and perhaps that is something that for North Africa could also be, put into the balance of initiatives a bit more stronger, because there's not really sort of at the moment a lot of investments in ensuring local sustainable food systems that can respond to the food needs of local communities. I think the ambition is there, but these need to be leveled up so that they can put into the balance with large-scale investments in energy, so that we have a holistic approach to the challenges in the region.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Sophie. We just received another question from Philippe Jacques from the European Commission, which I think, since we were just discussing the role of donors, could be interesting to hear your thoughts on this question in really a few minutes, because we are close to the end. So I will read it out. Institutional support at community level takes time, even if it is not always the most costly part of our programs. But sustainability means that efforts should not be abandoned even in the face of crises and emergencies or mega projects. What would be the best way to ring-fence funding to this institutional support towards resilience and peace building? Who would like to take up this question?
I can maybe I can take the example of North Africa, because in North Africa, for instance, like the water stresses and the vulnerabilities will continue to be felt by populations across the region. As annual rainfall rates decrease, the region will see multifarious downstream impacts on agriculture, industry, and the natural environment. So this will in turn affect many of the factors that are more necessary for people to lead a dignified life, such as food, hygiene, and health. So I think it's, as with climate change more generally, it's poor households that are most vulnerable to water scarcity, and international organizations and banks should consider supporting local communities rather than supporting the governments. There is this issue always of transparency, so it's important to support the local NGOs because they lack funding and they are facing some sustainability issues. Because adaptation and resilience initiatives must be directed toward these communities. Achieving water sustainability ultimately requires a multi-level approach that takes into account the relationship between urban and rural needs and between local, regional, and national levels. Because most importantly, efforts in this regard must be supported by strong administrative structures that span multiple sectors and stakeholders. And I think that international organization could support local communities in this way.
Yes. Thank you, Achref. Boubacar and then Roula.
Yes.
And
yes.
in a minute, really, because we will need to close in 5 minutes.
Yes, this is a really good question, and I will quickly provide some experience from the field. Now we have a kind of mind shift from those even local institutions, and that we have many investment tools and instruments through local NGOs, as he mentioned, that have some kind of transparency platforms and the transparent safeguarding financing institutions and ways of controlling and following the investment. And we also, as I said, you have a kind of local communities organizations. We succeeded in the Sahel region. I know that many sites, for example, that have been founded by the UE and other donors that are managed by women at local levels with help of local NGOs. I think they could provide important and sustainable ways to manage and secure the funds that are coming from donors and the international UE, which I greet, by the way, because we have the effort of European Union in our communities, and we are grateful for that.
Thank you, Boubacar. Unless anybody else has a point to add, I think
yes, I do.
Yeah.
I do have, because I've seen in the comments a question about Kenya, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and I'm interested because I started learning something about Kenya, because I might write a piece about Kenya, because as in other countries in East Africa, environmental issues are often viewed through the prism of water scarcity. In part, this is because water, its availability, management, and use will be central to Kenya and other countries' climate change mitigation strategy. Other environmental concerns and pressures such as pollution, desertification, and sea level rise are under considered elements in Kenya's broader environmental sphere and are intrinsically connected to water management. On the way to take into consideration would be to develop a broader energy transition strategy. There is no miracle solution, but this would locate water management within broader environmental considerations, including investment in renewable energy sources, the promotion of sustainable farming practices, and the protection of the country's ecosystems. Because, for example, water pumps could run on renewable energy sources such as solar and wind, offering a sustainable water supply and kickstarting Kenya's renewable energy sector. In addition, farmers in Kenya could be given water subsidized to return for a commitment to moving toward low water intensive crops. And also, I know that Kenya's first desalination plant set up in Mombasa. I think it's important to robust legislation on where desalination plants can be located. This will help protect wetland ecosystems and also increase public awareness of the country's ecosystems and their ecological and cultural value. Thank you.
Thank you, Achref, also to picking up the last question that I couldn't pick up earlier. So very good that we could also address some of the last questions. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I'll have to close. I think we had a really rich discussion today, so I would like to thank all the panelists for this. What I take away from this discussion is that first, there is really a need to better connect different scales from the local level, grassroots level of action, up to the national level, up to the regional level, and especially to do this, taking into account the interconnected with across sectors and across countries. So that's a first point that I think we should all retain from this conversation. The second one also was mentioned by Roula. It's the importance of creating knowledge and data systems that can really support integrated policy making, and also at the institutional level make sure that there are structures that can support more integrated analysis and decision making. And the third point, I think we especially in the Q&A session, we insisted a lot on this aspect of inclusivity. In the end, these actions on resilience really need to benefit and take into account the needs of local communities. So balancing the scales from readdressing or at least complementing larger scale solutions with locally led solutions that take into account the context specific aspects, also the peace building needs as highlighted by Boubacar of the communities. I think these are aspects that we can really focus on in the way forward. So finally, I would like to thank all of our panelists, Sophie, Achref, Roula, and Mr. Boko for sharing their insights about the water, energy, food nexus in their regions and ways to manage them. And on behalf of Chatham House and ECDPM, I thank you everybody for attending this session, and I wish you a very nice day. I hope you will also catch the other sessions today and tomorrow. And that's it from my side. Thanks very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.